Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I am your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, trying to highlight all nuance and perspectives of controversial issues, trying to break echo chambers, essentially. And my guest today is going to help me do that in an area that I am actively over and over and over again trying to break my echo chamber, because I am in an echo chamber with this topic. And through the magic of social media, various people led me in his direction. And this is Professor Rod Graham, professor of sociology and criminology at Old Dominion and host of the Conversations and Perspectives podcast. Professor, thank you for sitting down with me and having this conversation on critical race theory and some of the nuance that I am probably missing within critical race theory. Thanks for being here, man.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. So I talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but I have had on James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Travis Brown and a bunch of different people who are very critical of critical race theory. And I look at the spectrum of people. We have, like people who are Orthodox Jewish, like Ben Shapiro, lined up with someone who's like a super woke lefty, like Brett Weinstein. And they both say that they are against critical race theory. And I'm thinking like, oh, there's some stuff here that's going on. If these people who are polarized politically agree that this is, dangerous or bad, then I look for where the overlap is in a lot of things. So I reached out to a lot of critical race theory professors and emailed them and had phone conversations and diversity, equity, inclusion heads of schools and everything. And they would not come on the podcast. And it's really, really frustrating because I have no interest in anything other than getting the best arguments for a side that I feel like I just don't understand. I feel like I'm missing something. So your name was put in front of me as someone who can articulate things well. And I found you on social media and on YouTube. And I was like, oh yeah, this is what I'm looking for. All right. So thank you for being, I know you're not a critical race theory professor, but you are a sociologist. So I guess just to start off, what would you say is, just to get right into it, what would you say is the biggest gap in the thinking of people who are critical of critical race theory?
I think it might be first that there's a fusion between the academics and the politics that might come out of it. So you mentioned, for example, Brett Weinstein and then Ben Shapiro, like both against it, and I mean, I don't know them personally, but maybe one is more interested in how knowledge is produced, him being an academic, Weinstein, and then the other being the politics that might come out of critical race theory.
Yeah.
So fusing those things together can make it incredibly difficult to talk about it. It's like arguing with someone who has one idea about 10 different things. And so you would try, and it may be one of the reasons why you may have a difficult time getting people to talk to you. And I've heard this a lot, actually. And quite honestly, I do not advise it. I don't.
Because advise what?
Someone who doesn't do a lot of talking about critical race theory to talk about it.
Okay.
Because what might happen is that person has some understanding of it, but then that person then has to answer 1,000 different questions that may or may not have anything to do with what he or she is studying or their focus. And so it's like tell me the problem with medicine if you're a doctor. Like what in the world, how are you going to answer that? So right. That's probably one of the issues. So specific questions. So let's say people may have a problem with some of the ideas, especially as it relates. I can give you a
specific one if that's too broad. Would that be better?
Sure. I was actually going to name one, but maybe it's better if you've got one. Well, if you got one in your mind, I mean, I was going to say, okay, whiteness, for example. People are like, what is up with that? Okay. Yeah. So, all right, in that case, you would need someone who applies that in their research, whereas someone who may not have anything to do with that or care much about that now has to defend that particular thing, and it would
Robin DiAngelo. That's like the Robin DiAngelo kind of sphere, right? She's like a white
Yeah, whiteness,
professor.
white fragility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which people really don't like. To put it mildly,
Yeah, but we can stick with that one. Like, here's the thing. I think white fragility exists. I think exists in a lot of people. I mean,
Mhm.
I know that I get defensive if someone calls me a racist. I think that's a very natural response, but I also I feel like I can articulate it with logic about why I would get defensive. The same way I get defensive if someone called me a pedophile. I would get defensive about that.
Yeah,
And I would say, based on what, like let's figure this out. I read her book, and stuff like, I was at a picnic and I was worried that I was going to have to sit with a group of Black people. It's like, I don't know, lady, maybe this is an issue about you. It's kind of like Freud, like Freud, everyone wants to have sex with their mom. It's like, maybe just you do. Do you ever
projection.
think about that?
Is that what it is?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess because I have a very diverse circle, and I've intentionally so, of, political viewpoints and racially and sexual orientation and all that kind of stuff. Plus this podcast has helped. Is that I don't think that way. I don't think that, I don't use skin color as like a top tier way to like label people or group people. So it just doesn't ring true to me, I suppose. That's one of the reasons I have trouble with it.
Yeah. And people have brought that particular part of the book up a lot. I actually, I do teach a race and ethnicity class when I get the time, and I have assigned some chapters out of that book. My own take on it is, in its own domain, I think it's okay. So let's say you are some business owner, or you're some administrator somewhere, and you have a problem with getting people to talk across racial lines. All right. So then you say, look, take this book here, read it. It might piss you off, but just read it anyway. And then let's sit down and let's talk about why the Black employees or the Hispanic employees are having a problem. So then it becomes maybe more practical, something like a field guide.
Mm.
But what has happened is, it's just the synergy of, the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, and all of a sudden people there's also some cohort effects that are almost out of this, hard to explain in this podcast. But I mean, the generation that's coming up now is very different than mine, and probably different than yours, and how comfortable they are talking about race, I believe. And they're also more politically active, it seems. So in any case, the book was like sitting on a shelf for like 2 years, and all of a sudden, boom, it became a New York Times bestseller. It was out for a while before it became a bestseller, I believe. Yeah. And so now that book started to be like a flashpoint for critical race theory and people applying it in different settings. I don't know. On my podcast, I had Cedric Simmons, who is a sociology PhD, and he has problems with it too. And we kind of came to a conclusion that outside of that diversity training domain, it may not necessarily be something that you should use to explain anything in the real world. Yeah. So I mean, you said you read the book, so I can tell you that a lot of the early chapters are almost like, standard intro to social stuff, like the idea of, like, she reels off the stats about, the US Senate 70% white, and all this kind of stuff. We use that to explain that, okay, there's still some examples of racial inequality. She talks about color blindness, I believe, which is a standard kind of explanation. Then she cobbles it together into this new thing called white fragility. Yeah. So it starts off as a pretty milquetoast type of thing. And then she creates this idea that if it wasn't 2020, it probably would have just been just something that you'd read and then just throw it away, right? So
yeah, I was listening to a breakdown of it, and it was like a biracial guy talking about he was reading like the part where she was breaking down about people who are biracial, and he's like, the power of some, and that really resonated. I was like, yeah, like some people who are biracial feel this way. Some white people do. Like, if you just add some in there, I would have like a lot less of a problem with what she's doing. You know what I mean? It's like some. And like some, it's like, yes, some. But when it becomes all, Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo are like two of like the most, I guess, well-known, because they're on Good Morning America and stuff like that. Ibram Kendi, same thing. It's like some people, but when it becomes this binary of you are racist or you are an anti-racist, then it, like, what do you think? I mean, you're the sociology professor. Is it these all-encompassing things of always or never? When you're talking about social science, isn't that a tricky kind of road to go down, to say like all people are this or all people are that, or am I off on that?
No, you're right.
Yeah.
So I'm more of a, I guess you'd say, a quantitative sociologist, and so we deal with probabilities. So it's never absolute.
Yeah.
So with the kidney thing, yeah, I don't know. I first started, I was like, I've gone back and forth. So maybe I've moved more towards the having problems with it side. So first I started like, what is he talking about? Racist or anti-racist? I don't know what you mean by this. Of course, there's too much complexity here. All right. So then I thought about it for a while, and I watched a lot of his YouTube things, and I read 2 of his books. The history book is awesome. It's the uncontroversial one. Yeah, the one that won the award.
Yeah.
Kind of started him off, and then I read the How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I like that too, because we're a similar age, and he's talking about things that I've gone through. I'm older than him, but similar and generally. So I said, okay, I see the value in this. He's talking about things like space racism, and I've done this. I've looked for the neighborhoods that probably implicitly I was like, okay, if this neighborhood is a Black neighborhood, it might be dangerous, this type of thing. And I think a lot of people do that subconsciously. He talked about colorism, which when I was growing up was a big thing in my community. We simply, guys were very attracted to light-skinned women. This can be very difficult, I think, for some people, maybe even white folks, but within the Black community, this is a conversation that goes on all the time. Yeah. So anyway, I was like, okay, I see the value in this man's scholarship, and I see why he's so popular. Then I realized that and so I thought that the racism, anti-racism thing was just for race stuff, which kind of would make sense to me. If you're voting for a policy and you understand that it will have a negative effect, then that might be seen as racist. And so you want to vote for the policy that does not have a negative effect. I got that. But this idea that everything is racist or anti-racist, I think is obviously too simplistic.
Yeah. So, like, there's things about like systemic racism was one of those things that, like, when I was, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, I was like, of course, systemic racism is like a thing. It's everywhere. Look at these, look at the demographics and all that kind of stuff, the statistics. But then I kind of went to the other side of like, it's not a thing. Show me a law that is. And then actually, because of George Floyd and because of BLM movements and stuff like that, and because of me kind of developing into always trying to find the other side, I came out of this just in the past several months with like a better understanding of systemic racism, trying to explain it to people that say it's not a thing. And I guess like I did a video about how sports and the college sports specifically and the music industry would be systemically racist, or the war on drugs is systemically racist. You can go back to the, like my argument for curious on your thoughts on this, because like sports, like college sports, disproportionately represented by Black, college athletes, and no pay, even though tons of money is being made off of them. So they're risking everything. Okay. In like NCAA Division I, music industry, like music and sports are really like viewed as the way out for a lot of these kids. And then the music industry signs you these horrible contracts that you're kind of locked into. It's like take it or leave it because you don't have a lot of other options. College sports seems similar. Like these are things that I think, like, whenever I think of systemic racism as it's a socioeconomic oppression, but it's these people are more heavily represented, so therefore it is viewed as being racist. I would like to know like what you would add on to my kind of understanding of what is objectively true about the statement of systemic racism.
Well, I mean, you hit on some things that I think I agree with, and you probably know more about those things than I do, like the signing of music artists and stuff. Like I know generally, but I really haven't thought about it that much. Yeah. When I'm trying to explain systemic racism, I first start by at least talking about how an institution works, and how an institution, let's say a school system, is not just one person. It's not even just one school. It's an entire district, and then you can layer on that district a county, a state, and then a nation. And so the laws that operate there can disproportionately help or hurt someone. So that's I guess in a general way, a way of thinking about systemic racism. Interestingly, because we're talking about critical race theory, which might be different than just critical theory in general, critical race theory started in the legal profession. And the idea was that laws were disproportionately hurting some groups.
Yeah, this was Derek Bell's work, correct?
Derek Bell, I think Ian Haney Lopez does a lot of work with this. Okay. And the idea is that, okay, let's look at the laws that were put in place, and let's understand that these laws are not objective laws, which people really, this idea of objectivity, subjectivity is a problem that people have, but it's like fundamental to critical race theory. The idea that a group of people can interpret the law in one way, and because they're coming at it from a certain standpoint, they're going to often help their group and disadvantage another. So then you have to come in and be critical of that and look at it and see, okay, from my standpoint, or from the minority group standpoint, how is this law hurting them, this type of thing. So it came out of the legal profession, and it sort of trickled out, and it's now all over, and the idea of systemic racism sort of fits neatly in that category. And we actually see it, actually. I mean, if you think about, so for example, we had a killing, not a kill. Well, I guess it is a killing. A death penalty. What's the guy's name? Who was put to death last night? I think his last name was Bernard. I can't remember, but sure. He was a black male. He was a part of a murder in like 1999 or something. He was just put to death last night. Okay.
Yeah.
He's guilty, right? I'm not for the death penalty, but he was certainly guilty. So that part is not under contestation. It's just people who don't like the death penalty. What they point out is that this disproportionately tends to fall on Black folk. So if you look at the data, it seems to be that if you're Black, you're more likely to be given the death penalty, which people might actually know without looking at data. It just seems kind of intuitive. Okay, that's systemic. You can't point to one person. In fact, calling someone a judge racist for passing down that punishment might be counterproductive. Yeah. They're just in a system as well. I mean, so you have to look at things like that. One of the most famous books is Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. I'm often asked, you can tell I do this a lot because I can just kind of ramble a bit. I'll stop after this. There's one of them. I'm often asked, like, what is a good thing from critical race theory? And instead of trying to point to one particular law that was changed, I like to point to The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
Yeah, about the prison system, correct?
That's right. And she's coming out of the legal profession. She's a critical race theorist, as far as I can tell. And she understood that laws were disproportionately hurting certain populations. And so she wanted to change those. So there are some negatives about critical race theory when you ask me about them, but there are some positives. There really are.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what it is the way I think about this is like progressives. We need progressives in our society. We need people that are going to push forward. But we also need the conservatives to buttress that and say like, whoop, pump the brakes. I think Michael Malice had that quote where he said, conservatism is progressivism with speed limits. And I think that makes sense. And so we don't want to conserve things. We don't want to stay the way we are. We want to advance as a society. And that's going to take a lot of ideas. And we're going to throw all these ideas out, but then they're going to be slowed down and vetted and picked apart. And then what we should be left with is some good way to progress as a country. But that requires that dance. It requires that tension to interact with each other and compromise and discuss. And that's, I guess, what led me to you is, so many people are unwilling to discuss. I follow Coleman Hughes and Chloe Valdery, and I really like what they're doing. And they both put out formal invitations to Ibram Kendi. Can we have a discussion? And Ibram Kendi, I don't think he responded. And I went on his Instagram and I was like, I would love to see this conversation. And he responded to me saying, well, they misrepresent my ideas. And I was like, well, wouldn't that be a great opportunity to clear this up? Coleman Hughes even said, we'll raise money for it and give that to the United Negro College Fund. And Ibram Kendi won't talk about it publicly with someone who resists him. And that's probably my biggest issue with this. And I want to get your thoughts, because someone like him, who this is his life's work, he runs the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston U. Like, what is your take on that? If we're going to try and steelman the critical race theory professors, why is it that I will never see Robin DiAngelo and Sam Harris talk about it, or Ibram Kendi and Chloe Valerie talk about it? Like, isn't that something that we should want to see? And as long as it's a good faith kind of discussion and debate.
So I have two answers.
Okay.
One is the short answer is I would not have done it if I was Ibram Kendi either.
Okay.
But I think it's because I am not entirely sure what the benefit of that would be. Actually, they start from different assumptions, and it seems like all that would happen would be Kendi just defending his work, which sounds good on the surface, but what does he stand to gain from that? Like, what is, I feel like if someone wanted to understand his work, which I tried to do, is to read it and then watch him explain it in other formats. And it's not like he doesn't get questions. I mean, I watched him do something at Harvard two weeks ago where the students were asking him real practical questions like, okay, so thank you for telling me about racism and anti-racism. What actually do we do? And so he had to come up with that. However, if he's in a format where people are questioning the fundamental assumptions of what he's doing, okay, so he's kind of put in a box, right? And I don't know if that's a good idea. So that's one answer.
Okay.
A second answer is, which is sort of contradicting the first, maybe, is that I think what happens in a lot of critical studies, he is not a critical race theorist, I don't think. He's a historian. Certainly he's critical, but I don't think he'd be a critical race theorist. But the words don't matter. We all get what we're trying to say here. So, is that there's this ethic within critical scholarship where everything is political, where you're coming from determines how you see the world and your values and goals. So there's no abstract, let's come up with some evidence and then let's take these assumptions and generate a conclusion and then evaluate the assumptions and the conclusions for its validity and all this stuff. These types of things you learn in a philosophy class or debate class. That ethic, I don't think is there. It's more, okay, we have these goals for dealing with oppression. Do you agree with those goals or not? If you agree with them, okay, then we can go ahead and try and figure out how to deal with that issue. But if you're telling me that you're a conservative and you think that there's no racism or that there's so little racism, because no one says there's no racism, right? There's so little racism that, I'm off base with this and you don't care about racism or anti-racism. Okay, fine. Then why am I even bothering to have this conversation? And I think I see that sort of ethic a lot, which is troubling. I agree with you with that.
Because for me, I see that schools are going in this direction and I'm concerned because I want something that's more like empowering. I taught in schools that were 0% white and these kids needed real structure. They didn't need extended due dates. They needed due dates. They needed structure because they don't have it in their lives. They needed encouragement. Like, you can go out and crush it. Yeah, you've been under a lot of unfair hands being dealt to you, but that's just going to make you stronger, guys. Go out and smash. Like, that's what I think that a lot of those kids need. I'm concerned, but if I could have my mind changed, and I've changed my mind on a lot of things, I would love it. Like, yes, that's amazing. But I've never heard that perspective that you laid out. And let me just make sure that I heard that correctly, because what I kind of got from you is, this is my viewpoint. This is the way I think it is. If you don't believe that, or you don't trust that, or you don't want to agree with that, okay, but that's what it's here. I wrote it down. Here's what it is. If you want to talk about the fundamental ideas of what I have here, this is my mind is made up. Like, I'm not going to change my mind. I've worked very hard on this kind of ideology or this viewpoint. So like that, it is what it is kind of thing.
A little bit. So there's a tremendous amount of debate within the goal itself. In fact, you're seeing all these ideas bubble up because it's baked in the cake. If you're an academic and you want to get tenure, you can't just repeat what someone else has said. You have to publish with something new. In fact, that's one of the problems, because you get all these new ideas out there and people are like, what does this mean? Food apartheid now? Where's this coming from, right? Well, that's baked in the cake. So it's not as if there isn't a lot of discussion. It's just that the way critical social science is that you start with a goal. There is racism. We need to deal with it.
Right.
There is sexism. We need to deal with it. There is transphobia. Okay, if you come in and say, well, I don't think there is transphobia, then one of two things will happen. One, they may say, okay, fine, whatever, I want to develop strategies to deal with transphobia. This is where the energy should be centered. So we don't really have a conversation. Just go vote, right? You think differently than me. And then the second thing that will happen, which happens on social media a lot, is, especially for the activist wing of this, so not necessarily academics. I wouldn't do this, not too often anyway. But this is what the activists will do. You don't agree with me? Then you must be a transphobe, right? Or you must be a racist or something. And so there's a place for that, but I think it happens way too much. So yeah. So it's not like they don't. There is not a lot of debate. I see it often. Yeah. And in fact, without it, there's no academia. It's just within the parameters that are set by the goal, I think.
Yeah, there's a great, the debate that went on, it was actually in front of Congress with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Coleman Hughes talking about reparations. And reparations is something, I heard you describe yourself as what, socially conservative and fiscally liberal, fiscally progressive. Yeah. So reparations was one, again, that I was kind of all over the place about. And listening to Sandy Darity talk about reparations shifted me more from that's a terrible idea to, well, if you frame it this way and you do it this way, then it's actually not a bad idea. It's kind of like Andrew Yang's universal basic income. People say universal basic income is overly progressive. And I was like, maybe, or it's really, really conservative. If you take away all social, welfare, all EBT, housing project, all of that, and only give them $1,000 a month, this is really conservative. But if you add on $1,000 a month, then it's very progressive. So there's nuance to play there. And when Sandy Darity is talking about ADOS, African descendants of slavery, compared to, Nigerian immigrants who are doing quite well in America, that kind of nuance, or baby bonds, like these kinds of things that you can really articulate and lay out. He's an economist. It's like, it starts to make a lot more sense than something like the great grandkids of William Lloyd Garrison paying, money to the great grandkids of Black slave owners. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't, yeah.
Yes, I get it.
So I think that nuance is really, really important in this whole thing. And why is that not, I guess wouldn't that be what comes out of these conversations, I suppose, is what I'm getting at.
You mean if people of different ideas come together?
Yeah. Like that's the benefit of these discussions, is where can we find some, even it's just a little victory or a little bit of a move. Because I moved just from that one lecture that I heard of Professor Darity, is I moved toward reparations aren't so bad, just from that 1 hour,
Well, I mean, that would be nice, I think. And I do believe, though, that maybe the public's understanding of anything race related is fused with critical theory and critical race theory. And I think that might be a mistake. So Sandy Darity, as I understand, is an economist out of Duke, and he's just your standard, this is not meant to be an insult, data miner. He looks at a lot of data and he generates conclusions. And so that's not necessarily, it's critiquing a system, but he's not starting from those assumptions of critical race theory. So
he arrived at them. That's a different, that's important, right? That's an important difference for you as a social scientist. I'm not trying to get, I'm not, this is my goal, I'm going to reverse engineer it, as opposed to I'm going to look at the data and where does that steer me?
It's possible. I mean, I don't that. So yes, in the abstract, you really should start with the hypothesis about what it is you think you might find, and then go and see if that holds in reality. And that is, this type of hypothesis testing is not a part of CT. It's more, they're more like bridge builders, I guess. They already know they want to build a bridge, so you just have to figure out how to do it. But getting to your point of discussion, yeah, that is a problem. It's a problem across critical scholarship and youth in particular. And I'm not at a university, so the university I'm at is more of a working middle class university. We get a lot of military. It's a pretty large university, but it's certainly not prestigious in terms of the types of active students we bring in and stuff. It's a mid-range school, and at those types of schools, I don't have the problem that I hear goes on the Harvards and the Stanfords and all this stuff where people can't come on campus and say anything. I think that's a big mistake. I don't know what to do about that, but you're right. Stifling debate means that you don't get that nuance, and you may not get to change your mind about things. For a lot of young people, it's speech is violence. I would not necessarily, and sometimes I do think that, but the way that they, like Charles Murray comes on campus and talks, and they say, "Oh, he can't talk," this type of thing. I think that's a bit of a mistake. So in a way, we're fusing generational changes with one particular discipline. And that's not me making excuses for it. I'm just kind of putting it more in a context. It's interesting that you bring up the ADOS thing.
Yeah,
I am a descendant of slaves on both sides from South Carolina, and I have read the book that Sandra Darity wrote. It was very well done, although a bit dry. And so yeah, I like those kinds of arguments, and I think that more people, what needs to happen, and sadly we're going in the wrong direction, is in our universities we're losing people like that, and we're getting more of the critical students, and it's something that's got to do with the fact, I think, that Robin DiAngelo has a bestseller. Ibram Kendi has a bestseller. I mean, if you're a grad student, yes, if you're a grad, it's sexy. It's sexy. That's a part of it. And if you're a grad student and you actually are interested in social change, you have an option. You can do the data crunching way, or even the long form, like doing interviews and collating the themes from the interview over a long period of time, which is really difficult. You can do that. Or you can do the critical scholarship, which might be a bit more sexy, but it doesn't require you to do so much work on the data collection. And I'm saying that, and someone's going to listen to this and tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. If someone wants to email me and say, no, Rod, you're wrong about that, that's fine.
Well, it's hard to deny that there are at least connections and some roots in postmodernism. And I've talked to people, I never took a postmodernist class, but I talked to people who said like the papers were so easy to write because it's just like, here's what I think and here's my worldview. But it does feel, it feels political. So here's what it is. Like when all this stuff happened with George Floyd, a lot of teachers that I like follow and talk to on social media and stuff like that, they kept saying, elevate Black voices, elevate Black voices. And I was like, agreed. And then I looked, I was like, wait a second. They're all progressives. They're all progressives. No one is saying elevate Thomas Sowell or, heaven forbid, Larry Elder, no one's even saying, elevate, even like Thomas Chatterton Williams, or like, I mean, there's people who are even on the left, but they're not like full on, quote unquote woke. And I reached out to one of the teachers and I said, why aren't you promoting any center right wing Black voices? And he said to me, like, very sincerely, he's like, well, are they saying anything different? I was like, well, John McWhorter says anti-racist movements are worse than racism. Yeah, I'd say that's different. That's different. And so why not read Ta-Nehisi Coates and Thomas Sowell and have these conversations about what's good about what's being said here, what's good about what's being said here, what's great about what Ibram Kendi, what's true about that, and what's true about, what Helen Pluckrose writes in Cynical Theories. Like let's just do it all, but it feels very political. And we also saw that in the protests where I saw a video of a white man in a Black Lives Matter shirt throwing water at a Black woman holding her baby who had a Trump hat. And I was like, whoa, okay. So this isn't just race. There's something to this. White people are shooting other white people in the streets, white on white crime over Black Lives Matter. So this is very strange. It feels like it goes beyond race. What are your thoughts on that element of it, where white men will shout down a black woman like Ayaan Hirsi Ali or someone like that who is, or Candace Owens, okay, who is, pushing against their narrative about race.
Oh, it's totally political. We're more polarized than ever. Why that is? It's kind of hard to say, man. I mean,
Yeah, like within critical race theory, like within that
oh,
kind of sect, why do you think that is? Yeah.
oh well, there's no polarization in critical race theory because everyone is of one side. So it's not. But what are you asking? Like, why they don't read Thomas? Well, I mean, look, honestly, as a sociologist who's progressive, after watching, I watch Laura McWater's podcast. I think a lot of people do. It's pretty popular. And after a while, I'm like, look, you guys are kind of talking. You're doing your armchair theorizing, and here I am collecting all this information. Well, not me, but the standard sociologist about racism, and you guys are telling me that this is something that's not going on. You're obviously political. You're a center. I guess they would not call themselves. They're not conservatives, but
Lowry might, but yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah, they're kind of in an echo chamber too.
I guess. And so I'm like, look, I don't need, I mean, me and Thomas Chatterton Williams are mutuals on Twitter, and sometimes we communicate. But when he tells me, when he tweets something about, well, this guy that got, well, let me see, what would be, the last thing was about the guy was put to get death last night. People were complaining that this is an example of how the American system is racist. Okay, so then he replies, well, no, see, if you look at it that way. And then he gives me a counter example of how, well, Dylan Roof is still going to die. He just isn't dying as soon or something like that. I don't know. So when I see that kind of stuff, I'm like, all right, fine. You might be progressive like I am, but on this particular issue, no. Go vote. But I don't need to. Yeah. We're just too far apart that there's no communication. Having said that, though, there are two sides, two ways of looking at all inequalities with women, and with racial groups in particular. And it's a structural argument that it's not inside the person or the culture. It's the laws, it's the institutions, And then another argument which doesn't get pushed enough, and that is that there are some cultural things that need to change within those communities. So you mentioned the fact that if you can talk to, when you're teaching in the inner cities, you could talk to a kid and say, look, you need to develop some kind of discipline here and turn things in on time. These kind of cultural things. That part is not talked about in sociology or social science or critical theory enough. So this is my critique now. I guess we're kind of moving into it a little bit. So even though I don't agree on a political sense with what Williams and Lauer and McWater say, because I think it's damaging. I really do. I think if a policy is put forth, that one person, that one conservative person who would have voted for an anti-racist policy, if I can use Kendi's words, now is not doing it because they watched Lauer and McWater the night before, and they're saying, "Oh no, well these black guys are saying it." Then of course, I'm not, So I find that damaging on a political sense. Now, in the research realm, I think there's nothing wrong with doing research on ways of dealing with cultural problems within a particular generation or family or an individual, and we don't do that enough. That would be something that I think even critical theorists, if framed properly, would not mind at least exploring in some way.
That would be great, and I think that would be a cool way to do it. Is say like, yeah, they can go hand in hand. It's almost like the W.E.B. In my class I talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, the two different approaches: break the system, or thrive best you can in this rigged system. So, like both. Like you can, if you feel like the dealer is out to get you, hitting you, crappy cards, you play your hand best you can, and you go through the necessary channels to change the dealer. And if we can work together in that realm, that would be ideal. Like I think about the war on drugs, and I'm doing a podcast coming up on fentanyl, and that was one that there's even audio recordings and like like formal like quotes and stuff from people in the Nixon administration saying this is the war on drugs is designed to lock up Black people. like it's there.
Yeah.
You look at these things, even like Breonna Taylor, what were they even doing at her house? Serving a drug warrant. Like there's over and over and over again these ideas. We talked about sports and music as the ways out. Well, how did even like the billionaire Jay-Z get out? He first had to sell drugs. Like, I mean, maybe he didn't have to, but he did as his way out. So the war on drugs seems like one of the best arguments for like, hey, let's restructure society in a way that would be less racist, because rich people can get access to drugs. I just go to my doctor. I say, oh, I'm feeling a little down. Here you go. Here, take some Xanax, whatever it is. I have some pain in my shoulder. Oh, here's some Vicodin. If I can't afford to go see a good doctor that'll hook me up, I got to score, heroin on the street. So like that kind of stuff, I think, is great arguments for systemic racism. But I haven't heard a lot of the critical race theory professors talking about the war on drugs. It was just like an example of one.
Right. Yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, they suck up a lot of air because they're in this moment and they're very popular. But behind, like, so if you look at a university website and you look at the social sciences, so sociology is a popular one, but there's also psychology, anthropology, even things like, so all the studies that I think Helen Pluckrose tends to not like, right? Within those, you often you get, at least for now, a nice breakdown of people who do that stuff behind the scenes that people never see, but it gets published in journals, where they're dealing with these really hard issues of drugs or crime or family differences or family breakdown, and showing the relationships. But something happens between churning out those things and the public getting it. It's just difficult for that to happen. So then what happens is you get someone who writes a book that's easily accessible, that is catchy, and I admit I do it. So I'm really the research that I do is in cybercrime. That's my issue: cybercrime and cybersecurity. And so there's a book called what's it called? The New Jim Code: Race After Technology. Now, it's a critical book. It's not looking at rates of crime and trying to explain how it happens. It's someone talking about how code leads to racism. Yeah, right. Well, I like the title. I may want to assign it because my students may find it sexy. So I'm contributing to that whole problem, Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be nice if we could do like the brass tacks kind of research and deal with these issues on the ground level.
That makes a lot of sense. Just in closing, like that makes a lot of sense that this is trendy. This gets people fired up, and this is, everything is susceptible to the market. So look at the news. What gets clicks? That's what we're going to put on the news. It doesn't matter. I mean, why? New York Times and some blogger. That's like the credibility is not always all that different. And that's because you got it. It's in this game of getting clicks and getting money. And you look at the success of Ibram Kendi, far more successful than Glenn Lowry. I mean, by a lot of metrics. And I could get why that would piss off Glenn Lowry. I get it. I mean, I think there's a little bit of player hating going on. But that is something that I think we should probably look at. Is like, this is trendy. It's wild. It's a little shoot from the hip. And then over time, it'll get its edges rounded and stuff like that. I hope.
Hopefully, we'll see.
So in closing, I want to ask, I really appreciate this conversation, man. I'm learning. It's like, people pay money, good money to go to universities to hear people like you talk. So I'm thrilled to be able to do this. I'm learning a lot. This has been great.
That would be nice.
There are people who listen to this podcast because the nature of it, because it's all perspectives and open-minded and challenging ideas. What advice would you give to people that I'm going to follow myself, this advice that you give about people who they've read Douglas Murray, Madness of Crowds, they've read Cynical Theories, they've done all that kind of stuff, they followed all of this, anti-wokeness stuff. What advice would you give to them to challenge that, to go into the truth within critical race theory, the truth that what is in this stuff that is valuable in Kendi, in D'Angelo, in, whatever, Alexis Shotwell and Miranda Fricker and all the really, really, out there stuff with whatever was it, privilege preserving epistemic pushback and stuff like that.
I don't even know that.
It gets intense. But like, what advice would you give to the people that are so convinced, and we're all about breaking echo chambers here, so they're in an echo chamber now that wokeness is bad and critical race theory is horrible and all that kind of stuff? What advice would you have just to try and challenge that?
Oh, wow. That's the same advice I give my mom when she's watching CNN. I
Okay.
mean, she's my mom is radicalized. And I know that sounds kind of crazy to say that about a 73-year-old Black woman watching CNN, but because that's all she watches.
Mm-hmm.
Trump is literally the devil, right? And okay, I do think that he was a bad president. I'm glad that he's a one-term president, but there were things going on that she was not aware of because she only watched CNN. And so, I mean, it seems simple, but if she would just watch something else from time to time and then combine them, it would have mattered. I mean, there's some intentionality here. Like you have to watch Fox News, which sounds crazy, but if you watch it, things happen. I think.
You gotta watch it within. Sorry to interrupt, but I want to. But like, you have to watch this with genuine curiosity, because you can't go, all right, I'll listen to Ibram Kendi and just the whole time be like, this guy's bullshit. Turn on Fox and be like, nonsense. Like, you have to go into it. How do you frame your mind though, Professor? Like, how do you frame your mind to actually want to be curious about this?
No, I just think listening to it. So you're seeing my room here. This is my home office, and there's a radio back here. And if I just turn it on, conservatives dominate radio. We don't have a good NPR station here. So I'm always listening to conservative radio. Yeah. Just listening to it over time will give you nuance. I mean, I don't know how to frame my mind differently. It actually does two things. It won't change your mind. And I don't think that'll be unrealistic. But what it does is it humanizes the people on the other side. And it then adds nuance to their ideas, so you don't think that they're completely loony. So I'm spending so much time on social media, probably too much, but some of that's because of the pandemic, I guess. And so sometimes when I start communicating with someone new, I can tell that they've never spoken to someone who has anything positive to say about critical theory. So they'll throw out these crazy bullet points, critical race scholars hate Western civilization. I don't think that's true. Critical race scholars are pseudo-intellectual. I haven't seen that either, even though I just said that sometimes the research is less rigorous. When it comes to actual brain power and thinking and thought and putting things together, no, it's the opposite. I find these people incredibly thoughtful. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but by immersing yourself in another environment, just over time, you'll soften your views of them. I think that's important because there are some people who want to get rid of a lot of these studies departments. And I think that's a bad idea. Like, it's one thing to push for more data-oriented scientists and all that stuff in social science. But as someone who is ADOS, African-American, and being at a university that has several of these departments, I see the value that students get. If you are someone who is queer, you want to take a queer studies class, or maybe even, if you want to spend your money on it, a queer studies degree, because it's meaningful for you. Those people are not going to then go out and go in the streets throwing rocks at people or something. No, they're going to take that and it's going to give them meaning, and then maybe they'll go off to get a master's degree, or maybe they'll go work in a nonprofit or something, but they know more about themselves. It's the same with African American studies or Chicano studies or something. And so a person with nuance about critical theory or critical scholarship in general may not say, oh, get rid of everything, this is terrible, right? Like, instead they'll say, okay, I see the value in it. I don't like the exorcism, maybe we can do something about it, right? And I think that's the best way forward.
Okay, so you believe that the value outweighs the possible risks of people getting radicalized, because there are some people that do go out in the street and push. There are people who are tear down the entire system, prison abolition and all this kind of stuff. Where it's just, well, hold on, like, there are those people, but you think the value that you've seen on campus stuff outweighs the risks of people being radicalized?
The 2% of Ivy League students with their hair dyed going out and doing that should not reflect the hundreds of thousands of students who get value from those programs. No, I don't think so.
That's a great way to, I think, to close this out. But what gets all the attention? What gets all the attention? The crazy ones who go out and do the thing. And so then it gives a bad name to all of critical race theory. I think that's a great way to kind of close this, Professor, is looking at it like that. Like, don't just focus on the biggest, craziest, wackiest ideas of critical race theory. It's a lot in there. And it runs the gamut. It runs all across. So don't just focus on the craziest stuff that they listed in like cynical theories, which I love the book and I love Helen and James, but like they do focus on the most extremes to show, like, sound the alarm, where there's a lot of stuff that they didn't leave it, that they didn't put in, that was like, oh, well, that's actually a good idea. Yeah. So let's not focus on the crazy stuff. So, thank you so much for doing this. I learned a lot. I think that I hope that my audience gets their echo chamber that is, I think, probably leaning toward critical race theory, terrible, evil, bad. Hopefully it softens that. I know it did for me. This is a conversation that I'm going to carry with me now in my tool belt. So
I appreciate it. You asked some good questions, and actually you made me think a lot about ways of dealing with the excesses of critical theory. So it was nice.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? I know that you're active on Twitter. I love following your Twitter, and also on YouTube. You have some great interviews on there that people can listen to, where you ask some questions. You get involved in some of the nuance with these topics. Where can people find you?
Well, my website, I guess, would be the hub of all that stuff, is roderickgraham.com.
roderickgraham.com, and I'll put it in the show notes and the lists and stuff like that. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right.